Okay, welcome to the 90th episode of An Evolving Man podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be speaking to Dr. Mark Stibbe again. Mark has been writing books since he was 16 and has clocked up over 50 titles. His PhD on storytelling was completed in 1982 and is published by Cambridge University Press. Lately, Mark has been writing novels in the magical realism genre. His novel, A Book in Time, was picked as the overall winner out of hundreds of entries in the Page Turner Awards. His latest novel is called House of Dreams, a Tudor ghost story, once again in the magical realism genre. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Piers. Good to be with you again.
Yeah, thank you for agreeing to come and speak. Really great to have you here. And yeah, it's really great to be having this conversation about the mother wound. So thank you.
Yeah, very timely with Mothering Sunday coming up, or Mother's Day this weekend. So seemed like a good opportunity to seize the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, a few weeks ago, I posted a video about the mother wound relating to my own journey on a retreat a few weeks ago, where that really came up for me, that distant mother, and that drew me to doing this video. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about what mother's love looks like to begin with.
Yeah. When I think about mothers, I just want to say that I'm going to talk about mothers and the mother wound. I think it's really important that people hear my heart, that I'm speaking in a spirit of gratitude and I'm not speaking in a spirit of condemnation or judgment. So I want to begin by saying that because there's two opposite and very dangerous tendencies, and one is to idealize the mother and the other is to demonize the mother. And I actually believe that what Dr. Donald Winnicott, the pediatrician and psychoanalyst, said is right when he wrote most mothers are actually what are classified as good enough mums. And so if there are mums out there listening to this, just want to thank you from the heart for what you do. And I certainly wouldn't want this to be a source of personal pain or self-hatred or increasing blame or whatever. The emphasis is very much on healing. So when I think about a mother's love, to answer your question, that was a bit of a preamble. To answer your question, Piers, I have all my life been very influenced by C.S. Lewis, who taught my father, my adoptive father. And he wrote a book called The Four Loves, where he took the four Greek words used in classical Greek anyway for love, and he translated them and showed us how specific their connotations are. So there was philia, which means friendship love, with a connotation of demonstrated affection between friends. There's eros, which means erotic or sexual love. There's a distinctively New Testament kind of concept of love, which is agape in Greek, A-G-A-P-E with an accent on the E, agape. That means more sort of self-sacrificial, self-forgetful love. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. That would be agape in the original language. But there's a fourth love that is neglected by most people when they think of love in Greek Hellenistic terms, and that's S-T-O-R-G-E with an accent over the E, storge love, which is parental, specifically maternal, nurturing, comforting, protective, affectionate love. So when I think of a mother's love, I think of storge. It may have elements of agape in it, but it really is a distinctive kind of love, which I think is shown primarily, particularly to the infant child by their mother, in three ways: through the mother's voice, first of all, as the mother speaks words of affirmation, words of celebration, words of life, sometimes even words of correction. But the mother's voice, both in utero, before a child is born, and after the child's birth, is critical. And it seems that one of the things that we found through psychological studies of parent-child relationships is that it's quite traumatic for an infant or for a very, very young child to be deprived of their mother's voice. So mother's voice is very critical. A mother's eyes are obviously very critical. The loving, storgy love way in which a mother looks at her infant or a child communicates affection in a non-verbal way. So the voice would be verbal, but the eyes would be non-verbal. And again, things like the still face experiment, which our viewers can look up on YouTube, just type in still face experiment, shows that it's traumatic to an infant or to a toddler, young child, when their mother turns their face away from them and the eye contact is withdrawn. That's very painful for a child. It can be very unsettling, disturbing until that eye-to-eye union and connection is reestablished. And then there's a mother's touch. So we know, for example, from the terribly distressing pictures on the news a couple of decades ago of Romanian orphanages, what can happen when there's what's called tactile deprivation, when children suffer from touch hunger, when they're not held by their mothers. It can be very traumatic as well. So the three main ways in which I think a mother shows storgy love are through their voice, through their eyes, and through their touch. And we know from James Bowlby's research, very groundbreaking research, that the first 2 years of a child's life very critical in terms of the primary female caregiver, the maternal figure in that child's life, whether it's the actual biological mother or an adoptive stand-in mother, that mother figure or that actual mother, as it were, that biological mother, literally kisses their baby's brain into life. So there is a neuroscientific research database that shows us now just how incredibly important, particularly the first 2 years, are for a mother to be showing storgy love through their voice, eyes, and touch for the development of the brain. And obviously, when a child misses out on that, they're going to miss out on storgy love, which I'm afraid will have consequences, perhaps for the long term. So we're talking here about something immensely important, because the mother's relationship for me is the primal relationship. She carries us in her womb and delivers us into the world. And if she does nothing else but that, we can thank her for giving us life on Mother's Day. If that's the only thing we can thank her for, then that's at least something.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, and as you were blessing and praising mothers, yeah, I'd like to say thank you to my mother for all that she did for me. And yeah, my relationship to her is much better. I had a hiatus for a few years while I had my breakdown in my 20s, where I didn't talk to her, but now it's much more loving relationship. So yeah, I kind of thank my mother. So, I mean, for me, you mentioned the primal relationship, and you mentioned a bit what happens a little bit. I mean, what does happen to the child when they miss out on this storky love?
I think we've got to be very careful to talk about the specific nature of the wound that can come from a mother, because there's no one-size-fits-all narrative here. So when I think about a mother's love, I follow really Bowlby's line that there are two forms of attachment. There's secure attachment, which has really positive, life-enhancing consequences for a child. If a child's brought up by a mum with constant eye contact, with an affirming and approving voice, with touch that is appropriate and tender and protective and soothing and reassuring, then I think at least two of the consequences for that are that that child grows up with a very strong sense of self-worth, of self-image, of significance and security. So you'll find that a child that has had that kind of storge love input on a regular basis is content and happy to say, I am. But also, I think when that happens, that child is much better equipped to relate to others in a trusting way. After all, the relationship that is forged through storge love between a mother and a child, what that does is it fortifies the child's sense of basic trust. So if that basic trust is constantly being strengthened, then when it comes to relationships with significant others as the child grows up, there is a genuine belief that that other person's going to be reliable. Therefore, that child can entrust themselves to them. What happens when there's insecure attachment, which is a second form of attachment, is that the mother wound takes different sorts of shapes and storylines, and the consequences for those different unique storylines are also different and unique. So I talk about three kinds of mother wound, or three kinds of negative, harmful mothering styles that are symbolic and representative of insecure attachment. There is absent mothering, which can be either physically absent because the mother has abandoned the child, or the mother has died, or the mother is too ill or addicted to parent properly, or it can be emotional absence, where the mother is physically present in the home, so the child knows that the mother is there, but it's like the still face experiment. The mother's face is turned away. The mother's not invested in terms of emotional engagement in that child or that child's welfare and development. So there's absent mothering. There's secondly ambivalent mothering, which is a kind of very inconsistent kind of mothering, where the mother or the mother figure sort of drifts in and out of this child's world. And when that mother drifts in, sometimes that mother is emotionally ambivalent as well as physically ambivalent. So that mother might be sometimes very affectionate, and at other times sometimes very cold. And that's very confusing and disorientating to the child, because the child may not be vocalizing it this way, but the child will be asking, at least at an intuitive, pre-rational level, which mother am I going to get? So there's ambivalent mothering, and then there's finally abusive mothering, which is very, very harmful indeed, where the mother can be physically abusive, where the mother can be verbally or psychologically or emotionally abusive, sexually abusive, even at times. There's even religiously and spiritually abusive. There's multiple different forms of abuse. Now, when a child grows up with those negative mothering styles, Piers, what I think happens is that it sets the blueprint for adult relationships. So if the normal of a child in their childhood is that the mother figure is absent, either physically or emotionally, then that sets the sort of blueprint for the child's expectations when that child becomes an adult in terms of their own relationships with other people, especially romantic relationships, where absence can be regarded as a new normal too. Ambivalent relating as well becomes a kind of blueprint from childhood, which is then exported and imported into adult romantic relationships. So that's my normal. If that's what I was used to from my mum, then as a bloke with a woman, then it's perfectly all right for that woman to be coming in and out of my world, either physically or emotionally. That's what I was used to. Yeah, that's the blueprint sort of thing. And then finally abusive. Obviously, if that's been your normal tragically, then that may become your normal unless you go through a conscious reset. Then that may become your normal in your adult life as well. So the mother wound looks like something much bigger than just absence, because it can be ambivalence as well as absence. It can be different forms of absence. It can also be abuse, sadly. And I think that trauma, in terms of mother, for a child is usually one of two things. It's not just what's been done to a child, it's also what's not been done for a child. And either one of those storylines can produce trauma and pain in a child's soul that will reverberate throughout the course of their lives, impacting their adult relationships.
Thank you, Mark. That's really clear. The different three kinds of mother wounds. Was something you said there, which was really powerful. I love what you said earlier about the mother figure kisses their brains into life. That's really beautiful. And also what you were saying about the voice, but also the being seen, the eyes links in. I was listening to a Jungian analyst, Robert Moore, talk about the importance in ancient mythology about the eye, about being seen, and in the importance for children of being seen. And if we're not seen, then we don't exist. And
and it also, I think it relates to the Hebrew scriptures as well, where one of the great Hebraic names for God is the Lord who sees, Jehovah Roy. And it's the idea of we are seen, not, I think probably one of the unfortunate effects of boarding school religiosity and piety, chapel religion, if you will, is that it can reinforce the idea that the Lord who sees us is actually a bit like a housemaster or a housemistress watching out for us in our sins to reprimand, scold, or cane us. But actually, I don't think that's the sense at all of the Hebraic notion of the Lord who sees. It's about loving vigilance. It's about having eyes of tenderness set upon us in a constant way, day and night, because he does not slumber nor sleep and doesn't rest from this vigilant watching of his creatures, of his sons and daughters. So it's like it's a very ancient concept, isn't it? That's kind of widespread across cultures, mythologies, religions, and societies, and fascinating to see it. I think that to be seen is to be loved very often. Because if you are seen for who you are and celebrated, not tolerated, let alone denigrated, you are seen in a sense of celebration. It's just beautiful.
To be seen is to be loved. I so agree. And I'd love for us to segue a bit into how that links into boarding school. What is the mother wound in relation to boarding school? Because both of us have been, and both of us have experienced that. And while I was listening to the Jungian analyst talk, I could think, well, I didn't get seen. I didn't hear my mother's voice, didn't hear any praiseworthy voice, and I didn't have any touch either. So I'd love for you to talk a bit about that.
Let me just let me introduce that subject by talking about my two mothers. My biological mother, who gave birth to my twin sister and me, but was in a very difficult part and time of her life, single parent, put us in a home for unmarried mums and babies in Hackney in North London, and then travelled back up to the Midlands to look after her mother. So she wasn't in any position at all, Piers, to look after us. So we were taken into the arms of kindly Anglican nuns. So our story is, as I think I might have said in the last conversation I had with you, a bit like a replay of one of the episodes of Call the Midwife. So that left a hole, a void, a mother wound, a primal wound, as I call it, in my heart, in my soul. And I think in my sister's. I can't speak for her. She would have to speak for herself. And then I was adopted, along with my twin sister Claire, by Joy. And it was under her care that I was put into a prep school on my 8th birthday, September the 16th, 1968. So if you look at my life, my first 8 years, Piers, I had two iterations of the same storyline, the absent mother. So I had a mother who was absent because of poverty, and I had a mother who became absent because of wanting to, quotes, give me the best education that money could buy.
Mm.
A rather different narrative line from the one in Hackney, which could have gone in a very different direction. So that's also something we could talk about, the whole way in which we're bound by an obligation or vow of gratitude in many ways with our mothers that actually prevents and inhibits us from healing. But anyway, going back to the point, I think that the absent mother is one of the biggest wounds in British culture. Keep in mind that British culture, British institutions have historically, rightly or wrongly, I suspect a lot of time wrongly, been led by ex-boarders
Mhm.
who have had this massive denial and withdrawal of storgy love from their lives at a very young age. And it can be absolutely catastrophic. And I don't think people realize just how damaging that ruptured attachment with mother particularly is. I remember on my 8th birthday feeling a sense of incredible fear.
Mhm.
It was a terror, actually. I felt like I was alone in the world. There was a head teacher standing next to me as I stood next to my Mossman trunk on the gravel drive. I knew that head teacher was dangerous. I could sense it. I think children sometimes do have a sort of sense of intuition. And sure enough, on my first night, he beat me, gave me 6 of the best for dropping some marbles. So my fears, my terror, were justified, and I wanted my mother. I wanted my mother's protection. And the funny thing is, she wasn't a great mother. You know, she was a good enough mother, but still a good enough mother with many flaws is better than a head teacher who beats the hell out of you in front of your peers and makes you suppress your weeping underneath the sheets of your bed as you
Mhm.
hug your teddy bear. And I know that this is traumatic. I have a friend, my best friend at public school was a guy, I'm going to call him Billy. So Billy, what happened to Billy was, along with me and quite a few others, we were abused by a QC called John Smythe, who lived just outside of where the boarding school was, and who, with his wife, would invite vulnerable boys like Billy and me over to his house. And of course, we had been denied for 10 years, or less than 10 years, but a lot of years, the love of a parent, particularly a mother, but also a father, and the enjoyment of a normal family home with, you know, all that comes with that. And we didn't realize that he was actually a predator. And Billy and I were very badly abused. Billy worse than me in terms of criminal violence. And Billy to this day is still receiving trauma counseling. He's the same age as me, 63. His whole life has been utterly ruined by that. Now, when he went to see the top leading specialist in trauma in the country for counseling, after about 300 or 400 sessions, I think it was,
Mhm.
his counselor looked at him and said, I actually don't think that your abuse is the root of all of your problems. There's something deeper still. And Billy began to open up that when he was 6 or 7, he was carted off to his prep school by his beloved mother. We'll call her Jane. I knew Jane. She was a wonderful woman. Jane took Billy to the opening tea at his prep school. So all the new boys were there and their parents and the staff mingling, drinking tea, eating cakes and sandwiches, a kind of faux happy atmosphere. And at one point, Jane, his mother, tried to leave without being noticed. And Billy caught sight of her, the other side of the big hall, trying to get out of the room, and ran as fast as his little legs could carry him to his mother, held onto her skirt and said, please don't leave me, and was pleading with her and sobbing with her right to the car in the drive. And she just said, no, I have got to go and you have got to stay. This is the way things have got to be. And she drove away with him, his face red with tears, sobbing and weeping because he felt this rupture of attachment with his mother and had literally no power, no say in the process of this moment of awful, hellish separation. And this trauma counselor said that even deeper still, a worse trauma lies beneath this awful abuse that you've had at the hands of John Smythe. It is the trauma of abandonment from your mother. That day, that memory is what has ruined your life, or at least has marred your life. And he admitted it. He said, yeah, that's true. I've never thought of that, that there's a deeper root to all the fruit and the negative toxic fruit that I've been living with. And that deeper root is the abandonment by my mum. And so, yes, Piers, it's insecure attachment when it's then kind of brought into the experience of being sent away and exiled from home at boarding school can be absolutely devastating. And I think that a lot of our institutions, Piers, are led by people who have experienced that, but have no idea how to deal with it. Because like me on my first night, I decided that the best way to survive the 10 years that was to come was by shutting down emotionally. And what do? You forget to turn the switch back on when you leave boarding school at 18. You go into your adult relationships without switching it back on. That's damaging. But you then go into walks of life where you actually need to be switched on to read the room, to feel the room, to have empathy, but you can't do it as a leader because the switch is still off.
Thank you. Very powerful story about Billy, and I can really relate to that. And I think that thing about switching off the emotions, I think it's Nick Duffel talks about in an article in The Guardian about Professor Antonio Damasio saying that we can't make good decisions without emotional information. And what do we learn at school? Same, everyone shuts down emotionally. Most people that I hear, not everyone, but that's how we deal with it. So I'd love for you to kind of segue into about why do mothers permit their children to be sent away and separated from them?
I think that I wonder if you agree with me. I wonder if it's to do with generational trends. I do wonder about that. I think that there is something in that. I think that Carl Jung was right when he said every mother contains her daughter in herself, and every daughter her mother, and every mother extends backwards into her mother and forwards into her daughter. And it's like if the generational familial cultural story is going away to boarding school is the best thing for your child, why would you question that? And yet I actually do think, that even though my adoptive mother, Joy, was definitely within that tradition, I think her own experience of pain, even though it was sublimated, was enough to make her at least sensitive to what that experience of being sent away to school might do to me. So what happened, I'm going to show you my teddy bear from my prep school.
Wow.
This is Edward Bear, right? And my mum, bless her, for all her faults, she knew that this bear was probably the one thing that would keep me resilient, that hugging this teddy bear, Edward he's called, underneath the bed sheets of my dormitory bed, that would keep me from being completely finished. And so what she did, I don't know if you can see this, and I haven't touched it since, but she hand knitted herself the exact same prep school uniform for Edward Bear that I would be wearing, So he's got the same shorts. I mean, they're completely torn now. Look,
Uh-huh.
Cherith, my beloved wife, wants to send this to the repair shop, BBC program, and get the bear repaired because this bear has traveled with me all through my life. When I had my breakdown in 2012, 13, and I was traveling hundreds of miles to see my counselor, the bear sat on the front seat of the car alongside me in the passenger seat. Obviously, he wasn't driving, Piers, you'll be glad to hear. But here he is, you know, he's got the same school jumper, exactly the same school shirt material, shorts, everything. I think what that shows me is that my mother, for all the kind of buy-in to the cultural, familial, generational story that this is the best education that money can buy, and therefore it's entirely justifiable to effectively abandon Mark to Cheam School in 1968, that she had enough about her as a mother to knit a school uniform for my teddy bear so that there would be at least some semblance not only of home in the school, but also of solidarity between bear and boy in the traumas that were to come.
Thank you. Thank you. It's interesting. I've often heard stories. I think Nick Duffel talks about in his book, Anthony Worrell Thompson, the chef, who I think went age 6, but possibly even earlier. And he talks about that first night at prep school, and they've all got their teddy bears. That it was like, and he could hear people crying, but it was very soon apparent that when he saw one of the teddy bears flush down the toilets and people were starting to rip them apart, that it wasn't a safe thing to have. And I remember myself, my teddy bear, which was on the list of items we needed to bring. I started to use it as a rugby ball because it wasn't safe to use it as a thing of affection. And so,
Well, I think I'm glad to say that my bear and me made it. We were a bit broken, and we've got
mm,
less hair than we did in 1968,
mm,
but we're
mm,
still here, Piers.
you are. Yeah, I gave my teddy bear, my boarding school teddy bear, to Scouts a few years ago for a tombola, so some other child was able to have it was Rupert the bear, uh, that I gave away. So I'd love for us to segue a bit into, you know, we talked a bit about literature. There's James Bond. You know, what can we
Uh,
learn from James Bond about boarding school? Because the person who wrote James Bond, Ian Fleming, he was at Eton. I don't know, I presume he was at prep school before that. So what can we learn about the mother wound?
well, it's really interesting. I try, like you, to keep my eyes open in terms of contemporary culture and expressions of boarding school pain in the movies and in novels and all sorts of different areas, TV shows and so on. The Crown would be a perfect example of
Mhm.
a TV show where the boarding school wound is very finely explored, especially in season 1, episode 9, an episode called Pater Familias, which is about Prince Philip sending the young Prince Charles to the same prep school as me, Cheam, and then to Gordonston in Scotland. But I think that one of the most impactful moments for me was when I went to see Skyfall in the cinema, and I was not expecting to have my boarding school pain exposed during a James Bond film. But it was, and this is I think it's Daniel Craig's one of his best Bond films, directed by Sam Mendes. And it is a Bond film that's not just pure entertainment from start to finish, but is extremely reflectful and thoughtful and insightful about British culture. The key figure in this film is Judi Dench, who acts the part of M. Now, keep in mind that Ian Fleming used to refer to his own mother as M. And there's all the way through this film, there is an exploration of Bond's relationship with M as a mother figure. That's brought out very plainly in the scene where Javier Bardem, who's the baddie, Silver, he comes down a lift to meet Bond. Bond has been captured, and Bond is sitting on a chair tied to it. And in what I think, I counted it, I think it's 100-second single shot scene in which Javier Bardem walks from the lift towards Bond very slowly and utters what is effectively a parable about rats on an island and how rats will basically deal with the rat problem themselves if you create the right conditions, until there are 2 rats left, and the final rat is the one that eats the other rat. And so the clear message is that Silver and Bond are 2 rats. Who's going to be the one that ends up surviving? But actually what Silver does is he offers a kind of olive branch to Bond, offering for them to work together, because he says that basically we've had the same mother and Mummy's been very naughty. Now, what does he mean by that? He's referring to Judi Dench's M character. And he's referring to the beginning of the film where Judi Dench, M, effectively says yes to a shot to kill Bond, because there's a choice between him dying or a lot of people dying. And so Mummy's been very naughty in the sense that Mummy has actually given the go-ahead for a fatal kill shot for her son figure, or at least one of them. And so what Silver is trying to do is he's trying to tempt Bond to the dark side so that they can work together as 2 boys, as it were, wayward boys. But the thing is, with a mother wound like this, or like any mother wound, what it does is it can send you in one of 2 directions. One is conformity and the other is rebellion. So rebellion is one expression, negative, painful reflex to the mother wound. But conformity, or doing your duty, can be another expression of the mother wound. And Silver has obviously chosen rebellion. Bond has chosen duty or conformity. So Bond basically says no. And the film ends with a very vivid and tense battle sequence that happens in and around the house, the hunting lodge in Scotland where Bond was brought up, but where he lost his parents. That's when he became parentless. And there's a line, it's really significant, where M and Bond are talking just before they head down to the house to defend it against Silver and all his henchmen. Bond is basically talking to M, and M says to Bond that orphans always make the best recruits. And I remember hearing this line and thinking, oh my gosh, that is so true when it comes to espionage. It's like anything else in the British Empire. Like we were saying before this formally began, this interview, what's the best way to prepare particularly young men, but also women, to go to the farthest outposts of the empire and to be able to function in isolation without it emotionally destroying them? We'll send them to boarding school, get them to switch off their emotions, to tune down, if not to shut down completely, in empathy. And there you have it. You've got survivors. They may be emotionally completely robbed of all health and life, but at least they're going to be able to be armored enough in terms of their souls to be able to survive any kind of onslaught. And that's what Bond is. Bond is an orphan. And orphans who've been sent away to boarding school, because that's what we are when we're sent away, we become orphans, are the best recruits for these awful roles.
Thank you. It kind of links into what we talked about 6 weeks ago, that boarded heart. We board our hearts up.
Yeah, that's what Bond does, you see, because of the constant debate with all the Bond films isn't it? Is this character Sean Connery's version, Roger Moore's version, Pierce Brosnan's version, Daniel Craig's version, and whoever's coming next, are they actually capable of authentic relationships? Are they capable of intimacy? Are they capable of empathy? The very kind of nuts and bolts of adult relationships that mean something and last the distance if they've been shut down and they've boarded their hearts at boarding school.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You see that in Casino Royale, where he tries to he gets close to Vespa, and then she
Yes.
betrays him.
Yeah.
And it's again for me on a psychological level, the mother's betrayed him, and then the his partner betrays him.
Yeah.
And it's
So
interesting.
true.
The character, Judi Dench, she actually went to boarding school herself.
Mm.
So, you know, I
Wow.
I haven't read bits of her biography, autobiography. She doesn't say very much in her biography about what
Mm.
happened at school. But often I find I have to read a few different books to find the actual story. I found that with Tony Blair's book here. I bought it to read his boarding school journey, and he doesn't talk about it at all. And yet,
Mm.
I read his biography by John Rentoul, and he was basically beaten. Age 14, he ran away. He tried to leave the country, got on a plane to go to Barbados. And you're like, what happened at his school, which would, as we know, that running away from boarding school was very much the last option anyone would ever do because it was looked frowned upon so much that he would do that and call it on an interview that it was the most extreme thing he ever did and not talk about in his biography. I think that's
Mm.
quite telling.
Yeah, it's really telling. I
Yeah.
didn't know that. That's fascinating. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he was beaten as a 13-year-old, and then he was beaten again as a 17-year-old by the housemaster. 13, he was beaten regularly by the senior students, and they used to take a run up, and take it in turns to beat the junior boys. So, um, and also you mentioned about conformity in the rebellion from Skyfall. Nick Duffel talks about the strategic survival personality of conformist, rebel, the rebellious, and then the crushed. So it's interesting that
Mm.
it's almost like that's what the mother wound creates, and that's what
Yeah.
boarding school creates.
Yeah.
So I would love for you to talk a little bit about some of the main symptoms of the mother wound in the
Yeah.
lives of male and female boarders.
Yeah. I mean, I think that from what I've seen, and this is anecdotal, there is quite a difference sometimes between the way female boarders and male boarders can react to the experience of the absent mother and indeed the absent father. But if we focus on the absent mother, of course, the void in a girl in a boarding school has to be filled somehow. So, how is that girl going to respond? Now, I feel slightly uncomfortable talking about the female response, not being female myself. So I think there is a growing body of work on female boarding experience, pain, and survival and recovery, which I'm really glad of, because I think it's been quite a gap for a few years. But since Joy Chabarine's book, particularly, where she addresses some of these issues, we've seen a lot more. But I think what I've seen, and this is anecdotal again, is withdrawal or obsession. So when a female boarder is deprived of a mother's love, that could cause and has, in my experience, caused mistrust, which then mistrust in the female, in the feminine, which then has expressed itself in withdrawing from intimate, meaningful relationships with other females within the boarding establishment. Because after all, if you can't trust your mother to be there for you, then why would you trust your friend in the dormitory to be there for you, right? So there's withdrawal, but then there's also obsession, the crush, because the need is so strong that then you can overinvest in what's called relationship addiction or obsessive love, which of course is a contradiction in itself. So I think those would be kind of two of the expressions, symptoms, signs, whatever you want to call them, of female boarding school pain. And they can, again, they can continue on into adult life because the blueprint's being set at boarding school as well as in childhood. And then for men, I think I'm going here by my own experience as well, that I think there are, and there are many more consequences, by the way, than just withdrawal and obsession for female boarders. There's a whole list of signs and symptoms. So I'm just picking two, and I'll pick two for boys who become men. One is misogyny, and the other is sexual addiction. So sexual addiction, I would point to someone like Bill Clinton and his misuse of power and his relationship with Monica Lewinsky, where if you track back into Bill Clinton's childhood and his early years, very troubled relationship with his mother. His mother effectively abandoned him as a child. Monica Lewinsky, if you compare the photographs of Monica when she was working in the White House with the photographs of Bill Clinton's mother when Bill Clinton was a young boy, there are spooky similarities between the appearances of these physical appearances of these two women. And in fact, Bill Clinton said when Monica Lewinsky was removed from the White House, he used exactly the same turn of phrase as when his mother abandoned and left him. And that's why does she have to be taken away? Why does she have to live away from me? So it's like the same tapes get replayed in a very toxic way. So sexual addiction can be, or sexual deviancy can be a kind of pathway that is almost instinctively trodden by men who miss their mums because they're looking, I think, for a mother's love in all the wrong places. But then when it comes to misogyny, I think you can start to blame the mother, or in my case, the mothers in my life. I hadn't realized the degree to which my whole attitude towards the feminine, Piers, was dictated by the two absences. My absent biological mother in Hackney when she left, leaving Claire and me behind with the nuns. And then my adoptive mother replaying the same storyline, but in a posh place, a public school, rather than effectively in an orphanage. Although I would argue that boarding schools are orphanages for the privileged. They're still orphanages, and so I was then abandoned effectively a second time. I call it a second orphaning, as you know from the last conversation that we had. And I hadn't realized the degree to which my whole attitude towards the feminine, which wasn't helped by being 10 years in an almost entirely masculine context, was then affected negatively. And that lasted until I was in my 40s, when something very strange happened. Would you like me to tell you about what that was?
Yeah.
So what happened was I had begun to I'd obviously begun to think of women as abandoning monsters, because that's what had happened to me twice by my biological mother and my adoptive mother. That was affecting all my relationships with women. And then one day I was asked by a brilliant musician friend who'd written a sort of rock opera to come to London to a very small theatre and watch a run-through, a rehearsal of the whole thing. Because I'm a literary person, a film and theatre buff and so on, I was asked to bring a notebook and pen and just to take notes of the production, the characterization, the music, the plot, all the different facets of storytelling, which I was happy to do. But the actual storyline involved one woman who was in her late teens and who had had a baby and who had to give her baby up. And she was sitting in a very impoverished bedsit with a guitar, and she started playing a song about the pain that she felt having to give up her child. And instead of taking notes on a piece of paper about the nature of the song, I just was in floods of tears. I just started crying. I couldn't stop the tears. There's only 25 of us in this small theatre watching this thing play out. Everyone else was taking notes, but I'm bawling my eyes out because this is like listening to my mother's song. And then I kid you not, 2 weeks later, my adoptive mother turns up at the house where I'm living on a kind of random visit. And she sits down on the sofa opposite me and she said, opens her handbag and she says, "Here, I think it's time you had this." And it was a handwritten letter written by my birth mother in 1961 on the occasion of Claire and my first birthday, in which she described in a handwritten ink, perfectly beautifully written ink, writing, how she felt giving us up, but she knew and trusted that we would be in better hands and given a better future. And it was exactly what the girl had sung 2 weeks before in that small theatre in London.
Oh,
And so it was like the song prepared me for the letter. And when I read the letter, which I still have in my possession, obviously, it was life-changing because it shattered my vision of the feminine. It completely destroyed my false, toxic, ungodly belief about women. And it brought all that crashing down. And suddenly I began to see things in a more nuanced and a more kindly sort of way. And I was able to forgive my birth mother as a result of that song and that letter.
mm, thank you, Mark. It's a beautiful story, very touching. Do you feel that's part of the journey for healing, is learning to forgive our mothers?
Yeah, I do, but I'm not, and I'm sure you're the same. I'm not in any way underestimating what it takes to forgive, and nor am I prescribing that everyone should forgive. Everyone needs to make their own choice on this, but I do think forgiveness is a very powerful therapeutic moment if we can do it from the heart. And how do we do it from the heart? How do we forgive our mothers? You know, I said earlier, and I said we might come back to it, we are caught in this bind
Mhm.
that our mothers really thought and believed, rightly or wrongly, that they were doing the best for us by sending us away to boarding school to have, quotes, the best education that money could buy. And many of them, like my adoptive mother, made many sacrifices so that that could happen. So when you're going through the trauma of ruptured attachment with your mother, it's a very peculiar and complex, contradictory world in which you live, in which you want to scream, "Why have you left me alone? Why have you left me behind? I hate you. I resent you for doing this." But then at the same time, you're thinking in your head, but they've given up so much, and therefore I ought to be not screaming, but grateful.
Mhm.
Not hateful, but grateful. Those are your choices, and you choose to be grateful. And in choosing to be grateful, because that's what you know is your duty, you suppress again, you subliminate again um, all of that pain that actually needs dealing with. And I think there comes a moment, though, when I think that the pain becomes too much and you have to deal with it.
Mhm.
And if forgiving your mother is part of the therapeutic journey, if it's admitting that, no, she was wrong to believe everything that she believed. She was not wrong to believe all of it, but she was wrong to believe that this was going to be the best education that money could buy. Because the way it was always packaged to me, I wonder if it was the same for you. My father used to teach me, he was a housemaster, so he was basically living in this boarding school world. He sold it to me that, "Mark, you're going to have, my son, a very rounded education. You're going to turn out to be a fully rounded individual with the world at your feet." So, you know, he was sold this vision of the future that I
Mhm.
actually think was wrong, because how rounded could I have been if I was intellectually okay, if I was intellectually, my head was filled with light, but my heart was filled with trauma? How rounded is that? That doesn't sound rounded to me. And I think that's the way many of us turned out. We turned out with light in the head, but agony in the heart.
Mhm.
Um, and that ain't rounded. That isn't wholeness.
Mhm.
So forgiveness is really, really important, but how do you do that from the heart? Because it's the heart that's been so devastated. And forgiveness that's purely intellectual is dutiful, but it may not be complete in terms of therapy. And I think the answer lies in the French proverb, to understand all is to forgive all. I remember one time traveling in a car alone with my uncle Andrew, who was my mother, my adoptive mother's brother. And during the course of the journey, I decided to dare to ask some questions about my mother's upbringing. She and Andrew and their brother Bob were brought up in a very old school Anglican vicarage where dad was a vicar in Leicester, mum was a dutiful vicar's wife and a basically unpaid curate. And all three children were sent off, carted off to boarding school. My mum to St. Catherine's my mum to, I think it's St. Helens, somewhere near Wantage. And the boys, I can't remember where they went. When they came home, they were very much to be neither seen nor heard. So when Dad was counselling, when he was doing sort of pastoral care in the study with somebody from the parish, they were all sent upstairs. So much of my mother's life, when she was at home from boarding school, was spent locked in her bedroom, listening to her two brothers who were allowed to inhabit the same bedroom, playing and laughing with each other as they played with their toy soldiers on the floor, while she was kept completely alone and isolated. And the growing sense that I had in that car journey was of a person who was robbed, actually, of much of their childhood, robbed of a loving home, robbed of a kind of, I suppose, healthy vision of the church as well. Because, I mean, what kind of religion imposes that kind of incarcerating restriction on their daughters? It's not healthy. And so I had come during that car journey to a greater understanding of why my mum, my adoptive mother, was the way that she was. And although it didn't explain why she then sent me away to boarding school to experience the same agony, I did at least understand why she was so angry with me all the time. And here's the interesting thing. I left the church in 2012. That was the last time I wore a dog collar. And until the moment I wore a dog collar, my mother fought with me and didn't like me and was angry perpetually with me, scolded me. Nothing I could ever do was good enough. The moment I ripped that dog collar off, Piers, and became an ordinary, normal mortal once again, a writer rather than a vicar, my mother's whole attitude to me changed immediately. It was like she had always seen her father in me. And all the resentment that she'd never been able to express against him, she'd been leveling against the next nearest target-rich environment, which was me, the next nearest in terms of similarity, because I was exactly the same profession. But when I basically left that profession behind and decided that my Christianity was going to be about just simple trust in Jesus rather than in organized religion, that then she just completely changed. I remember when I was at the lowest point of my life, almost suicidal, I was a very dark place. She rang me up and just said these words, "Mark, never forget that you are a much treasured son." And she'd never said anything like that to me in my life. And I was in my 50s and I was lying on a bed with a mobile phone in my hand. I just burst into tears. And after that, my mother and I had the most fabulous relationship in the last years of her life. Forgiveness is powerful.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you. Mark, you are a much treasured son. That's beautiful words to say. And I often hear this from British people. I heard this, you know, my father was ex-boarding school and, didn't give me any praise, very much critical of me. When I've questioned this
Yeah.
with my family and they've said, "Oh, he did love you." And it's such a British thing. He never said it. He never hugged me, never touched me. He would always criticize me. "Oh, he did love you." It's like we don't understand in Britain. That's the old way, certainly, is that actually we need voice, we need praise, we
Yeah.
need to be seen, and we need to be touched, you know.
Yeah. I never forget, Piers, I was a vicar in Sheffield, just a mile or so north of Hillsborough,
Mm.
in a small parish, and I was sitting at my desk writing my sermon for Sunday. It's about Tuesday. And I knew that my father was staying about 45 minutes away in Matlock with another uncle
Mhm.
on my mother's side. And he had Parkinson's disease, and I didn't know how much longer he'd be with us. This is my adoptive father, very much of the same school as what you have just described,
Mhm.
shaking hands rather than hugging, occasional praise, but not much. Just be careful not to get emotional here. So it was very much stiff upper lip upbringing. But I realized, oh my gosh, I might not have him around for much longer. So I ditched my sermon, got in a car, and drove the 45 minutes to an hour over to Matlock, knocked on my uncle's front door. My aunt came to the front door and said, "Oh, what are you doing here? What a nice surprise." I said, "Well, just like half an hour with Dad, please, on my own." And she said, "Fair enough." So she gave us a room. It was a strange room, Piers, because it only had two armchairs in it and not much furniture. And the armchairs were, for some reason, in opposite corners. And my dad shuffled in and sat in his armchair, and I sat in my armchair. And his speech was quite slurred, and he was salivating, and he was really showing all the advanced signs and symptoms of Parkinson's. It was very distressing. But he managed to get the words out, "What can I do for you?" And I started to walk from my corner to his because I felt like I was there to tell him something I had never told him in my life. And I describe that walk as the longest journey that I have ever taken. And I've been on some pretty long journeys in terms of miles, but not emotional miles. And I stood a few feet away from him. And I said, "Dad, I'm just here because I want to tell you something I've never said, and that is that I deeply love you. And I'm really grateful to you for everything." And somehow he managed to get to his feet, which wasn't easy, and I felt it right not to help him. And he shuffled towards me in his old frayed leather slippers and fell into my arms. His arms were so weak and thin, not strong and robust like they were when I was a little boy, but very weak. And he just held me and whispered in my ears that he loved me too, and that adopting me was the best decision he ever made. And I'm so glad I did that because it broke something. And I was able to share that story, at his memorial service in Norwich Cathedral, where the place was absolutely packed because he was a much loved head teacher and friend to many. And I can't tell you how many fathers came up to me afterwards and said, "I wish my son would do that for me." And
Mhm.
I thought to myself, but you have to take some steps towards him if we're going to break this British cultural um, disengagement that's so unhealthy. we've both got to make some sort of gesture towards each other. And I am so glad that I did that. Do you remember the Railway Children when Bobby is waiting on the station for her father and the train pulls in
Yeah.
and the steam is pouring out? Everyone gets off the train and then it's just Bobby, and she thinks that he's not on the train, and then he appears out of the mist and she shouts, "Daddy, oh my daddy." And there's an unbelievable embrace. And I think, for all of us who've been to boarding school, we need that. We need that.
Yeah. Yeah. What a beautiful story. I'm kind of in tears listening because I think I told you in the podcast episode we did 6 weeks ago about my relationship with my father, my last conversation with him. And yeah, that it was different. I know I didn't say I love you. I said the opposite. Um, but yeah, it's very touching, and I do see that. So I think Robert Bly talks about, again, I might have referenced this 6 weeks ago in his book Iron John, that often sons are there by the bedside of their fathers, waiting for them to say, I love you, wanting them to be seen because we're not seen. And as I shared in that video I did a couple of weeks ago about the mother wound, I feel when we go to boarding school or some form of trauma, parents aren't there, we're not seen, we have missing parts of ourselves which we project out into the world. We're looking for the father, we're looking for the mother, and often that, I feel, comes about in affairs because it's the distant mother we're looking to
Yes,
complete, and actually we have
so
to
true.
complete that within ourselves. And I've heard so many stories of that, of ex-boarders who have affairs.
Yeah, yeah. It's very true. But I think that, we not only have it in ourselves to mother ourselves better and to stop harming ourselves by
Mhm.
being so unkind to ourselves. But the good news is, and I really want to say this on this podcast, because obviously I come from a faith-based perspective. That's what's
Mhm.
true of my approach to boarding school pain, or perhaps distinctive even, if that doesn't sound too um, pretentious. But I think that it's not just within ourselves that we have this capacity to mother and father our own hearts in a way that makes up the deficit. But I believe that honestly, with all of my heart, that there is that capacity within the heart of God as well, because I think that God is not just perfect father, she is also perfect mother
Mhm.
too. And I
Mhm.
think that one of the things that boarding school religion has done is that it's made God very remote and very masculine.
Mhm.
Because after all, those sorts of images of God are going to reinforce the stereotype that undergirds the British imperial vision. You want to be very masculine and very, very remote in your own personality. So why not forge a God in your own image? Well, I think that's what happened
Mhm.
historically in boarding school chapel, whereas I think that actually true Christianity is best summed up in Rembrandt's amazing portrait of the return of the prodigal son, where the father is wrapping his arms around his returning boy. But if you look carefully at the hands of this extraordinarily forgiving and affectionate man, one hand is portrayed as masculine and the other hand is portrayed as feminine. And what Rembrandt is trying to say in a very indirect, subtle, and covert way is this: that God comes to us not as a long distance parent, but as an intimate parent, and he can parent us both in a maternal and a paternal way, making up the love deficit in the embrace of the Holy Spirit. Now, this is where I think we get things wrong because we have a boarding school religion that historically has completely and utterly denied the role of Spirit, the Holy Spirit, who is the love bond, the connection of intimacy between not just the members of the Trinity, but between them and us. I think that that's produced a religion that's remote rather than relational. And therefore, what we have in sort of organized religion is a deity that's like, just like, almost exactly like the parents that left us at boarding school and who are distant and far away and you can never really connect with except through an occasional letter or when you're allowed a phone call. Whereas actually, I don't think that any spirituality is supposed to look like that. I've moved beyond what I would call traditional and evangelical kind of spirituality to a mystical view of religious life, where I think what really matters is intimate communion. And therefore, the whole far away thing, the whole remote thing just doesn't work for me and wouldn't ever work within boarding school therapy, because it's exactly in that embrace that we find our healing. And it's not therefore just a case of me mothering and fathering my own soul with kindness and with affection and forgiveness where that's necessary, but also it's something outside of me as well as inside of me, something external that's spiritual, that's real, that comes to hug the hell out of me. And it's like the Hebrew scriptures, Psalm 27, verse 10. Even though my father and my mother may abandon me, the Lord will hold me very close. What an extraordinary song that was by King David. Even though we might get abandoned by a mother, not just a father, but a mother, the Lord will come and minister to the sense of abandonment in our hearts. And that's a mystical, therapeutic reality that I think, when added into the normal, brilliant psychoanalytical discoveries and approaches are being used by many of my colleagues out there who wouldn't take a faith-based line. When we get this all together, I think it's going to be so profound for wholeness for people, because no one person's got it all together, but I suspect that all together we've got it.
Yeah, yeah, so true. Yeah, thank you. The God conversation, I've not really had it on the podcast. For me, I think my experiences at boarding school with the abuse which was going on by the chaplain, that I really hated anything to do with God. I remember being on Big Side, which was by the cricket pitch, and one day my friend had committed suicide and I was there and I was going, I hate you, it's like, why have you done this to me? Like, really raging. And I think it was only in my 20s, and I was part of a church group for a while when was having my breakdown in my 20s. I went to Romania to deliver aid, but I was always kind of keeping a distance. It was when I went to a Buddhist monastery and they were talking about devas, and I said, what are devas? They're talking, this talk. And I said, what are devas? They said, oh, they're angels. I said, angels? They exist? And they're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And who's Brahma? Oh, Brahma, he's God. I'm like, what? God actually exists? Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm like, my mind was being blown. I was like, I thought it was all a lie. And so, yeah, I kind
Let
of.
me just come in on there, because that is really profound what you just said, and I'm deeply sorry that that's embedded in your backstory, that awful trauma, because it's enough to turn anyone away from God, from the love of all loves. I'm not surprised. I know many people. I mean, amongst the Smythe victims, I'm one, but we were all Christians under John Smythe, but I'm the only one left who is a Christian out of all the victims, about 20 of us. And I think that's because I made a conscious decision when I was about 26, 27 years old, that everything I was going to believe and teach for the rest of my life about God would be the exact bloody opposite of what John Smythe taught and represented. He was an abusive, angry, violent man, and his God was an abusive, violent, angry, abusive God. And I have taught ever since then that he is the most loving parent of all. He is the father, mother we've been looking for. And he doesn't treat us in the way John Smythe treated us. And nor is he remote and indifferent and far away, like the college chapel taught me. There's something very, very different about what I think Jesus of Nazareth was trying to bring to us, that organized religion and abusive religion has hijacked. And I'm forgetting back to the original script, the original founder and the original vision, and tearing away all the horrible accretions of time and seeing with fresh eyes what he was really trying to represent to us. And I think it's something far more beautiful and certainly far more life enhancing than ever we've been told.
Yeah, yeah, I so agree. I think yeah, we could go off many tangents here, and I'm aware of time. I mean, I've got a few more questions, but is there anything else which you're really wanting to speak about the mother wound? I mean, some of the other ones we talked about forgiveness, um, also just healing, you know,
Yeah,
anything else
yeah.
you'd like to add in about how we heal
Yeah,
the mother wound?
maybe can I just say one more thing if that's all right?
Of
And
course.
it's to do with the human brain. I mean, the more I look at the human brain and study the human brain, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so please hear me. I'm very much an amateur, reliant on other people's incredible wisdom, but I marvel at it. I think the human brain is phenomenal. And I think when it comes to healing, the human brain plays an extraordinarily important part. But I do think also that it's not just enough to harness the resources of the neocortex part of the human brain
Mhm.
for our healing. So, in other words, if all that we're doing is actually learning a new perception, a new way of reasoning, a new way of believing about ourselves and our lives, I don't think that's enough. I don't think it's enough just to enlist the power of logic for us to experience a therapeutic breakthrough that lasts. I think we also need to have something that affects radically the limbic system as well, so that the emotions are transformed, not just the way we think. I do believe that one of the problems with some forms of therapeutic counseling for ex-boarders is that they address the front part of the brain, but they don't address the feeling part of the brain. And I know from what you've just been saying about the retreat that you guys have recently done, that the feeling part of the brain has definitely been activated in the therapeutic journey you've all been on. I talk about revelation and rewiring because I think that the human brain is beautifully neuroplastic and
Mhm.
extraordinary, has an extraordinary inbuilt capacity to change, to morph into healthy ways of thinking. But I think something more than just standing in front of a mirror and saying, I'm no longer abandoned. I am loved. I am worthy of love. I am worthy of belonging. Reciting those things, yes, they may change the way I think in the neocortex, but actually it's not enough on its own for us to be completely transformed and set free. We do need something that will impact the limbic system. So I think revelation needs to accompany, at least, if not precede, the rewiring process. So I talk very much about the impact on the heart
Mhm.
of something outside of ourselves that transforms us. So for me, and I will finish with this, at the lowest point of my life, I told you about my adoptive mother saying, You're a much treasured son. But I needed to know, Piers, I needed to understand why I had become the person I had become, because I was so unhappy with my choices, and I was so deeply depressed by the darkness that was sort of enveloping me. And I knew about my own choices, my bad choices, but I wanted to know what kind of things had made me sort of docile and vulnerable to making those bad choices. And I remember I was in California, and this woman who I'd never met before stepped, we were in a room together, and she stepped forward towards me. She said, "May I say something to you?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." She had a very lovely motherly sort of temperament towards in her, and I was very much at ease with her. And she said, "May I put my hand on your shoulder?" I said, "Yeah." And she put her hand on my shoulder and she said, "I have never used this phrase in my life before, but I have this sentence or this description of your normal. And it's this, that you have accepted a lie, and the lie is the normalcy of love withheld." And suddenly something happened to me. It, I can't describe it other than to say when I was a little boy, I remember going to the doctors when I had a very severe earache because I had a build-up of wax in my ear. And this doctor produced this enormous syringe. I was absolutely terrified, filled with hot water, pushed it in my ear, and then flushed out all this gunk into a bedpan. And I looked into it and I thought, all that dirt, that filth's been in my head, affecting my hearing. And it was exactly the same experience when I heard this normalcy of love withheld. She said, "Your birth mother displayed it. Your adoptive mother," how she knew these things, I don't know. We'd never met. She knew nothing about me. "Your adoptive mother displayed it." She then went through other mother figures, including the Church of England, because St. Augustine said, "If God is your father, the church is your mother." Well, I'd felt very, very, very much as if love had been withheld by the church from me. So she went effectively through the whole of my life, telling me all the moments where I'd accepted the lie that it's normal to have love withheld from me. And it was like I was syringed. All this hot water of love just blew out all this gunk from my body, from my brain, enabling me to hear correctly for the first time. I went back to my very rundown motel room. This was in the States, in California, and lying on the bed, I was just praying. I was saying, "That was remarkable. What's it all about? I need something more to understand that." And I just remembered this statement from Psalm 84, verse 11. "No good thing does the Lord withhold from those who walk with integrity in him." And it was the only verse in the entire Bible, both Hebrew and Greek, that had anything about anyone withholding anything that I could see. And basically, I think that God was saying to me, if I can put it in that kind of language, that I'm never going to withhold love from you. Anyway, the next day I was sitting having coffee. And again, this was in a Starbucks in California. This woman who I know from England, known for a long time, called Rachel, very motherly type figure, came in and went, "Oh, Mark," and then came over and gave me a big hug. And she said, "I was praying for you this morning, and I had Psalm 84, verse 11. No good thing does the Lord withhold from those who walk with integrity in him." And she said, "He's not going to withhold anything from you." And that night, I slept like a baby. I'd been having nightmares all my life about abandonment. And that was in 2013. And I've not had a nightmare since, 10, 11 years later. That affected the limbic system. You see, that's what I mean by an epiphany, an illumination, an enlightenment, a disclosure, revelation. It affects the limbic system, and then it helps you with the rewiring. So you're not just putting all the a heavy lifting work on the neocortex part of the brain. There's something outside of you as well as something inside of you that has the capacity to heal you. And together in collaboration, cooperation with the divine, you can get it done.
Beautiful, beautiful stories. Really, yeah. Love that story about California and yeah, about the mother and withholding love. So yeah, beautiful. So how do people find out more about you? Do you have a website and somewhere
Yeah,
to
I mean, if people are struggling with the mother issue, the very best thing to do is to get hold of my novel, A Book in Time, because it's about the search for the mother. And I've never been able to really write a sort of memoir,
Mhm.
a kind of literal non-fictional narrative about the search, my search for a mother's love. But A Book in Time is my fictional story-shaped
Mhm.
expression of that yearning and where I found it. And I honestly believe that will be of the best help. They can read Home at Last, which is the book you referred to, I
Mhm.
think, well, we referred to last time, which is about the healing of boarding school pain. But as Nick Duffel rightly said, you know, when he reviewed Home at Last, we don't really go into the mother wound, the primal wound in Home at Last. That I would say I've much more addressed in A Book in Time, the novel. So I do think that would be a healing experience for people to read. I would hope so, because that's what I was praying for when I wrote it.
Well, I'll put that into the description so people can get a hold of that. I'll put a link in for Home at Last as well, and I'll put in links to the previous episode of the podcast as well, so people can listen to that. But thank you so much. It's been very healing, tearful, joyful. So thank you, Mark. Really appreciate you coming
Thank
on
you for
to.
being such a brilliant conversational partner, because you have a very calm, gentle, empathetic way of drawing stuff out of me. And yeah, it's both incredibly liberating and also slightly disarming at the same time. It's a real gift. When I say disarming, I mean that in the nicest possible way. You know, that is a very rare gift. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you. Thank you. Bless you for your work. Okay. Take care.